Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of just like sheer precision. It feels very much like engineering.
Yeah. Really?
You break your arm, you go into a clinic, they do an X-ray, and it shows that jagged white line right on the bone. And the doctor just points at the screen and says, there it is. There is the problem.
Right, right. It's binary. It's completely undeniable. And honestly, I mean, it's comforting, right?
Oh, sure.
We are just deeply wired to want things to be visible because if we can see it, well, we can categorize it. And if we can categorize it, we can fix it.
Exactly. But then, you step into this realm of human emotion or neurodevelopment or just like psychological suffering. And suddenly that pristine X-ray machine is just utterly useless.
Yeah, completely useless.
We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't put a fractured ego in a cast. You can't put a blood sample under a microscope and say, yes, right there, here is the despair.
Which is pretty much the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. Yeah.
Because when you move from the physical body to the human mind, the observable evidence, like a person crying or lashing out or isolating themselves, that only tells a really, really tiny fraction of the story.
Right.
It's the symptom, basically, not the source.
And that is exactly where we are going today. So welcome to this deep dive. We are just so thrilled to have you with us as we plunge into what is arguably the most massive tectonic shift in the history of modern psychology, the cognitive revolution.
It's a big one.
It really is. The mission here is to unpack how the field of psychology shifted its focus from merely observing what human beings do to actually hacking into the impenetrable black box of the human mind to figure out what we think. We've got a great stack of comprehensive psychological texts today detailing the evolution of cognitive behavioral therapies.
And it is just a remarkable journey. I mean, for a really long time, science simply didn't know what to do with the internal dialogue you hear in your head all day.
They just ignored it, basically, yeah. But we are going to explore how pioneers in the field figured out that your thoughts and beliefs are not just, random, meaningless background noise. They are the actual code that programs your emotional reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to uncover how your internal dialogue dictates the world you live in. And most importantly, we're going to walk through the practical, evidence-based tools for rewiring the unhelpful thought patterns that hold us back.
Sounds good.
So let's start by setting the stage a bit, because to understand how radical this shift was, we really have to look at what therapists were doing before they cared about our thoughts. If we rewind to like the 1950s, psychology was essentially treating humans like incredibly complex vending machines, right?
That is actually a very apt way to describe it. Classical behaviorism, driven by figures like B.F. Skinner and John B. Watson, traditional behavior therapy was just the absolute dominant force.
Right.
And you have to understand why they took this approach. At the time, psychology was desperate to be taken seriously as a hard science, akin to physics or chemistry.
They wanted to sit at the grown-up table.
Exactly. And they were reacting against that earlier Freudian era, which was just full of unprovable, invisible concepts, the id, the ego, deeply repressed childhood memories.
Stuff you can't see.
Right. The behaviorists wanted measurable, empirical data.
They wanted things they could put on a clipboard and literally count.
Precisely. So their rule was, look, if we can't observe it, we aren't going to study it. They focused purely on environmental conditioning, classical and operant conditioning.
Stimulus and response.
Yeah. You ring a bell, the dog salivates, you reward a rat, it pulls a lever. And what is most critical for you to understand here is that introspection. The act of looking inward at your own subjective thoughts, your memories, your interpretations, that was explicitly thrown out of the scientific window.
Wow.
It was considered totally irrelevant to changing human behavior.
Which, I mean, looking back with a modern lens, just seems incredibly absurd.
Yeah, it does.
It's like trying to fix a malfunctioning computer by only looking at the monitor and the keyboard. You can observe the screen glitching and you can press the keys to see what happens, but you are completely ignoring the actual software code running in the background.
Yes.
The behaviorists were essentially saying, well, if I can't physically hold the software code in my hands, the code doesn't exist. I only care about the hardware.
But wasn't it incredibly controversial at the time for scientists to suddenly care about subjective thoughts?
Oh, massively controversial.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is that cognitive approaches, anything dealing with subjective thoughts, were viewed as completely unscientific for a long time.
Heresy, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But, you can only ignore reality for so long before the cracks start to show. By the 1960s and 70s, researchers were just running into walls. They realized that pure behaviorism was an incomplete picture of the human experience.
We're not just rats pulling levers.
Exactly. We aren't just rats. We are meaning-making machines.
So how did the dam break? Like, how did thoughts become, quote-unquote, scientific again? Well, it happened in stages. You had researchers like Albert Bandura developing social learning theory, which basically proved that people learn through observation and modeling. If a child watches an adult punch a doll, the child might punch the doll too, even without direct reinforcement.
And that implies something is happening inside the head.
Exactly. That requires cognition. It requires the brain to anticipate, process, and store information. But the real turning point, the moment things shifted, was when scientists figured out how to actually measure the impact of a thought in a laboratory setting.
Okay.
A pivotal moment was this 1968 study by a researcher named Velton.
Oh, right, the self-talk experiment.
You know it. Yeah, Velton basically proved experimentally that the self-talk and the interpretations people place on events directly and measurably determine their physiological and emotional responses.
How did he do that?
He took subjects and had them read and really internalize statements that were either elating or depressing. And he showed that just by manipulating that internal narrative, you systematically change the person's mood and their actual physiological state.
So you prove that the software actually matters.
You prove the software dictates the hardware.
Yeah.
It was empirical validation. Cognitive therapy didn't take over because it was just like a neat philosophical idea. It took over the mainstream because these once subjective internal states were proven to be measurable, they were manipulable, and they were absolutely vital to human behavior.
And what blows my mind is that this revolution was largely spearheaded by two brilliant minds who were working like completely independently of one another in the exact same era.
Yeah, the synchronicity is amazing.
They were both discovering this secret code at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And the first of these figures was a man who drew his inspiration not just from clinical science, but from ancient philosophy.
Ellis.
The founder of Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, REBT.
Ellis is just a fascinating figure. He was highly didactic, very action-oriented, and he based the entire foundation of his psychological approach on a single quote from the Stoic philosopher Epictetus.
From, like, 2,000 years ago?
Yeah, nearly 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And the quote is, "People are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them."
I mean, let's just sit with that for a second. People are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. That is a massive paradigm shift.
It really is.
It takes the power completely out of the hands of the external world, right?
Yeah.
And it puts it directly into your own mind. And Ellis formalized this philosophy into what he called the ABC model.
Yes, the famous ABCs.
This is the absolute core of REBT, and honestly, it's a framework you can start using in your life the second you hear it.
It really is. The ABC model is brilliant in its simplicity. So let's break it down. A stands for the activating event. This is the external situation, the adversity, the factual thing that happens in the physical world. And then C stands for the consequence specifically, your emotional and behavioral reaction.
Okay, so if I get passed over for a promotion at work, that's A, the activating event.
Right.
And if I feel devastatingly depressed, go home and, I don't know, drink half a bottle of whiskey. That's C, the consequence.
Exactly.
And the way human beings are biologically wired, we naturally assume A causes C. Like, I am depressed because I didn't get the promotion.
We conflate them instantly. And from an evolutionary standpoint, that conflation actually makes sense.
How so?
Well, if A is a rustling in the bushes and C is you feeling terrified and running away, it pays to skip the deep philosophical analysis.
Right, yeah, you don't want to overthink the tiger.
Exactly. Efficiency equals survival. But in the modern complex social world, this mental shortcut causes immense psychological suffering because Ellis introduced B, which stands for belief. B is your rational or irrational belief about event A.
And this is where the entire cognitive movement pivots, right?
Yeah.
A does not cause C. The event does not generate the emotion.
Right.
It is just neutral data. It is your belief, B, about the event that chemically creates the emotion.
It is a profound shift in psychological mechanics. You are not a passive victim of your circumstances. Your beliefs are the mandatory filter through which reality must pass before it becomes a feeling.
That's powerful.
Let's look at the classic road rage story from the sources to illustrate this, because it perfectly demonstrates how quickly B controls C.
Oh, I love this example. So imagine a man named Roger driving down a two-lane road. Suddenly, a red minivan speeds past, cuts him off, and forces him to slam on his brakes. That is A, the activating event.
And immediately, Roger experiences C, the emotional consequence. He is absolutely furious. His heart rate spikes, adrenaline floods his system, he's gripping the steering wheel, swearing, and he decides he's going to tailgate this driver to teach them a lesson.
We've all been there.
Right. Now, the common sense view is that the minivan made him angry. But REBT says no. Roger is angry because of his B, his belief.
Right. Roger's internal dialogue in that microsecond is telling him, this driver is a selfish, arrogant jerk. He is actively disrespecting me. People should not drive like this, and he must be punished.
Exactly. That specific belief generates the physiological rage, but watch what happens to the emotion when the belief changes.
Okay.
Traffic comes to a halt at a railroad crossing. Roger, still enraged, throws his car into park, hops out, and marches up to the minivan's window ready for a fight.
Oh, boy.
He glares into the car, but then he looks into the back seat. And there, sprawled across the back, is a woman in active labor, breathing rapidly, clearly in immense distress.
Wow. And in a fraction of a second, Roger's road rage completely evaporates.
It vanishes.
It turns into embarrassment, empathy, and this overwhelming desire to help. He immediately asked the driver, oh my God, is there anything I can do to clear a path?
Right. Now, think about the mechanics of what just happened. The activating event, A, never changed.
Yeah, the minivan still cut him off.
He still had to slam on his brakes, but his belief updated instantly. His new belief became, this isn't a selfish jerk disrespecting me. This is a panicked, terrified father trying to save his wife.
Right.
And because the belief changed, the emotional consequence, the neurochemical cocktail in his brain changed instantaneously from rage to compassion.
You are not disturbed by the minivan cutting you off. You are disturbed by your view of why the minivan cut you off.
Exactly.
Now, I can hear a listener analyzing this and saying, okay, sure, that works for a misunderstanding in traffic, but wait, aren't some activating events just objectively terrible?
It's a fair point.
Like if someone loses their job or survives a natural disaster or gets diagnosed with a terminal illness, is REBT really saying it's just their belief making them upset? Because that borders on victim blaming. It sounds dismissive of genuine tragedy.
Yeah, it's a really vital distinction to make, and REBT addresses this very clearly. Ellis was never, ever suggesting that we should be emotionally numb to tragedy. RET draws a hard, bright line between healthy, adaptive negative emotions and unhealthy, rigid negative emotions.
So it's the difference between profound grief and, like, destructive despair.
Precisely. If a loved one dies, the rational belief is, this is incredibly tragic, I loved them deeply, and I didn't want this to happen.
Yeah.
The consequence of that rational belief is intense sorrow, grief, and mourning. And those are healthy, appropriate emotions that actually help you process the loss.
Right.
But an irrational belief would be, this absolutely shouldn't have happened to me, the universe is fundamentally broken, and my life is now completely worthless and impossible to endure.
I see.
The consequence of that irrational belief is clinical depression, complete withdrawal, and an inability to function. REBT targets the irrational, rigid demands.
So it's the rigidity that's the problem.
Yes. Ellis actually categorized the specific types of irrational beliefs that destroy us. One of the big ones is awfulizing. This is when we convince ourselves that a bad situation is literally more than 100% bad.
More than 100%.
Yeah, like it is the absolute worst thing that could theoretically happen, completely beyond human endurance.
Oh, right. And then there's another major category, which is self-downing, right?
Yes.
This is that cognitive error of equating your total holistic human worth with a single external failure or rejection.
Exactly.
Like, I failed this math test, therefore I am fundamentally defective as a human being.
Yep, that's self-downing.
Yeah.
But the core of almost all psychological disturbance, according to Ellis, comes down to dogmatic demands, the musts and the shoulds.
Ah, yes. Ellis famously referred to this as masturbation.
Such a great term.
It really is. It's this deeply ingrained, rigid belief that the universe must treat you fairly, that other people must always act considerately, or that you yourself must never make a mistake.
And you can see the evolutionary glitch here, right? When you hold a rigid must, you are putting yourself in direct conflict with reality.
Because reality doesn't care.
Exactly. The universe is completely indifferent to your rules. It is not obligated to follow your demands.
Right.
If your belief is a preference like, I strongly prefer that people treat me fairly, but I accept that humans are flawed and sometimes they won't, then when someone wrongs you, you will feel appropriate annoyance or disappointment.
Which is manageable.
Exactly. But if your belief is a demand, people must treat me fairly, Then when they inevitably don't, your brain interprets it as an existential threat and you experience homicidal rage or deep despair.
So what does this all mean? Okay, we understand the architecture, we know the ABCs, we see that our irrational demands and our awfulizing are the faulty software causing our emotional crashes. But what is the actual intervention? How does an REBT therapist go into the code and fix it? That brings us to the D and E of Ellis's model.
Right. So D stands for disputing, and E stands for an effective new philosophy. Once the therapist and the client have isolated the irrational belief, the B, the very next step is rigorous, active disputation.
They don't just let it sit there.
No, not at all. And this is where REBT really differentiates itself. The therapist is not just going to sit there, nod passively, and ask how your childhood was. REBT is highly active, it's highly directive, and heavily focused on the present moment.
The sources mention the process of disputing breaks down into 3 distinct phases, right? Detecting, discriminating, and debating.
Yes. First, you have to detect the beliefs, because most people are completely blind to their own internal dialogue. You have to train yourself to actually hear the musts and the shoulds firing in the background.
But you can't fight what you can't see.
Exactly. Second, you discriminate. You learn to dissect your thoughts and separate the rational preferences from the irrational demands. And third, you debate. You actively argue against the irrational belief, challenging its logical validity.
And there are a few primary strategies therapists use for this debate, right?
Yes.
Sometimes they use a didactic approach, which is basically a direct lecture. They will flat out explain the philosophical failure of the client's logic. But more often, they use Socratic questioning.
I love Socratic questioning. It's so elegant because it bypasses defensiveness. Instead of telling the client, hey, your thought is wrong, the therapist asks a series of pointed questions that sort of guide the client into cornering themselves with their own logic.
Make it make sense, basically.
Exactly. Like you say, you must have everyone's approval. Well, where's the evidence that this is a law of nature? Who wrote that rule? What happens to you physically if someone disapproves of you?
They also rely heavily on empirical and functional disputes. The empirical angle asks for the data. Is there a law of physics stating you must always succeed at everything you try? And the functional angle is just extremely pragmatic. Like, okay, let's say you hold on to this belief that your boss is a monster who should be fired. How is holding on to that belief actually helping you achieve your goal of having a peaceful workday? Is this belief serving you, or is it just giving you an ulcer?
Yeah, that functional dispute is incredibly powerful. And one of the defining and sometimes, controversial characteristics of Albert Ellis's style was his relentless use of humor, exaggeration, and these creative metaphors.
He didn't pull punches.
No, he really didn't. He would frequently take a client's rigid demand and stretch it to its absolute absurd logical conclusion to show them just how ridiculous it was. The whole goal was to jolt the client out of their self-pity and get them to stop taking their own thoughts so seriously.
There is this fantastic dialogue recorded in the sources where a therapist is using this exact technique with a client named Mark.
Oh, the Tarzan one.
Yes, so Mark is severely depressed. He feels his life is over because he believes he absolutely must have the love and approval of a specific woman named Jane. And the therapist uses a very forceful, almost theatrical approach to disrupt Mark's thought loop. So Mark is starting to see the point, and he says, well, it's nutty to put myself down for what I do wrong. And the therapist immediately jumps on that and says, that's the message. Now, how about nutty thought number 2? That you must have the lovely, glamorous, and scintillating Jane. Come on, Tarzan, why must you have her?
Come on, Tarzan. It's just a brilliant therapeutic intervention. I mean, from the outside, it might sound abrasive, right? But neurologically, it's a circuit breaker.
It really is.
It instantly highlights the primitive, almost cartoonish, chest-beating nature of his demand for this woman. The therapist is absolutely not mocking Mark's pain. They are mocking the absurdity of the belief that is generating the pain.
Right.
By affectionately calling him Tarzan, the therapist breaks the trance of despair and forces Mark to confront the reality that he is demanding control over another human being, which is an impossible, completely irrational pursuit.
It cuts right through the noise. And REBT also heavily utilizes this thing called referenting, right? Which is a cognitive cost-benefit analysis.
Yes.
The client literally maps out the pros and cons of maintaining an irrational belief. And all of this is reinforced with intense homework. You don't just talk for 50 minutes and go home.
No, you have to do the work.
You are assigned worksheets, you practice new self-statements, and therapists will even assign shame-attacking exercises.
Those are wild.
Yeah, deliberately putting yourself in slightly embarrassing, harmless situations to practice tolerating the frustration and realizing you actually survive it.
The ultimate goal here isn't just symptom management, though. Ellis wasn't trying to just, put a Band-Aid on a panic attack. He aimed for what he called elegant change.
So what does elegant change actually look like in the human brain?
It means the client achieves a deep structural emotional insight. They don't just intellectually parrot the ABC model back to you. They adopt a profoundly new, rational philosophy of living.
It becomes part of them.
Exactly. They permanently surrender the demand for perfection from themselves, from others, and from the world. They develop radical, unconditional self-acceptance. They know exactly the mechanisms of how they upset themselves, and they possess the tools to stop doing it. They essentially become their own therapist.
It is an incredibly empowering model. But, while Albert Ellis was on the East Coast acting as this philosophical brawler, forcefully debating his clients, another pioneer was discovering a very different way to access the mind. This leads us to a highly structured, almost medical approach to dissecting our thoughts.
Yes, we have to turn to Dr. Aaron T. Beck, the father of cognitive therapy, or CT.
Right.
And the historical synchronicity here is just fascinating. Beck and Ellis were developing their theories at roughly the exact same time in the 1960s, completely independently of each other.
Wow.
But their origins couldn't have been more different. I mean, Ellis was drawing from Stoicism and philosophy. Beck was a medical doctor. He was a practicing psychoanalyst deeply steeped in the Freudian tradition.
Which is wild when you think about it, because psychoanalysis is entirely focused on the deep, dark, impenetrable unconscious mind.
Right.
Freud believed that depression was essentially anger turned inward, rooted in repressed childhood conflicts. So Beck, being a rigorous scientist, actually set out to conduct empirical research to prove Freud's theories about depression.
He really thought he was going to validate psychoanalysis.
Yeah, but his research completely failed to do that. Instead, he kind of stumbled backward into a totally new paradigm.
He did. Beck noticed a pattern during his free association sessions. His patients would be talking about their dreams or their childhood, but Beck realized they had a secondary stream of consciousness running in their heads that they weren't reporting to him.
Like a background track.
Exactly. It was a rapid, parallel track of thoughts. They were having quick, spontaneous, evaluative thoughts about themselves, about Beck, or about the therapy room itself. Beck termed these automatic thoughts. And his big breakthrough was observing that these specific automatic thoughts directly, universally preceded their shifts into negative emotions.
So contrast that with Freud, right? Freud is digging in the basement of the psyche with a flashlight, looking for deeply buried unconscious motives.
Yep.
Beck looks around and realizes the keys to the kingdom are sitting right there on the coffee table in the preconscious mind. They are completely accessible.
You don't have to dig.
Exactly. You don't need years of dream analysis. You just have to pause the patient and ask, what exactly was flashing through your mind the millisecond before you started crying just now?
Exactly. The preconscious is accessible with directed attention. And when Beck focused his research on depressed patients, he discovered what he called the negative cognitive shift.
What's that?
So depressed individuals were not just passively enduring sadness. Their brains were systematically actively ignoring positive data in their environment and obsessively fixating on negative information. They were unintentionally distorting reality to maintain their depressed state.
And Beck crystallized this observation into what is known as the cognitive triad, right?
Yes.
He found that depression is structurally maintained by a triad of severe negative evaluations. Number one is a negative view of the self. The automatic thought is, I am inherently unworthy, I am broken, I am incompetent.
Right.
Number two is a negative view of the world or the environment. Everything is overwhelmingly difficult. Life is a series of insurmountable obstacles. Nothing is fair.
That's the second.
And number three is a negative view of the future. Nothing will ever get better. My suffering is permanent. There is no hope.
And once a person's mind is locked into that triad, the brain acts like a faulty sorting machine. Every piece of incoming information is forced through this lens of hopelessness.
Right.
If a friend cancels dinner, well, it confirms the self is unlovable. If they get a promotion, the brain dismisses it as a fluke or a bureaucratic error.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's use an analogy here to map out Beck's architecture. If we think about the mind as a computer operating system, these automatic thoughts like, I'm a failure or everyone hates me are like annoying pop-up ads that suddenly flash on your screen.
That's a great way to think about it.
You didn't double-click on them, you didn't ask for them, they just spontaneously appear.
Yeah.
But the pop-up ads are just the surface symptom. The reason you have the pop-ups is because somewhere deeper in your hard drive you have a piece of malicious code generating them.
That maps perfectly onto Beck's structural model. If we connect this to the bigger picture in cognitive therapy, that underlying malicious code is called a schema or a core belief.
Schemas.
Yeah, schemas are deeply entrenched cognitive structures. They are the fundamental blueprints by which you organize and interpret the world, and they are usually formed very early in childhood based on our environments.
So they're deeply ingrained.
Very. So if a person develops a core schema of, I am fundamentally unlovable, that is the source code. When they go on a date and the other person is 10 minutes late, that specific schema activates and generates the automatic thought, the pop-up ad that says, see, they don't care about you. They are going to abandon you.
And Beck expanded this understanding into a massive comprehensive theory called the generic cognitive model.
Yes, he did. The generic cognitive model essentially proposes that all psychological problems, whether we are talking about major depression, generalized anxiety, panic disorder, or even certain personality disorders, are essentially just extreme exaggerations of normal adaptive human responses.
Wait, really? Exaggerations?
Yeah, and these exaggerations are driven by faulty information processing. The brain's hardware is fine, but the software is misinterpreting the incoming data.
So, to debug the system, we first need to understand exactly how the code is corrupting the data. Like,
Yeah.
how is the system taking a neutral event and twisting it into a catastrophe? And that leads us to one of Beck's most famous, lasting, and universally applicable contributions: cognitive distortions.
Yeah, cognitive distortions. These are the specific, identifiable, logical fallacies our brains use to process information incorrectly. They are systematic errors in reasoning.
We all have them.
We do. Now, evolutionary biologists will point out that we all use heuristics, mental shortcuts, because the brain has a limited cognitive load. We can't process every piece of data objectively. It takes too much energy.
Right, it would be exhausting.
Exactly. But when these shortcuts become rigid, habitual distortions, they generate massive psychological distress.
So let's walk through these funhouse mirrors of the mind, because anyone listening to this will immediately recognize their own brain in at least a few of these patterns. I know I do.
Oh, absolutely.
First up, arbitrary inference, which often manifests as catastrophizing.
This is the brain's tendency to jump to the absolute worst possible conclusion without any supporting evidence.
We do this all the time.
Oh, yeah. You send a text to a close friend, they don't reply for 3 hours, and your brain immediately skips over the logical explanations like, they're busy, their phone died, and leaps to the catastrophe. They are furious with me, I must have offended them, our friendship is over.
Right. You have zero empirical evidence for this, but your mind treats the catastrophe as a proven fact.
Yep. Next is selective abstraction.
Ah.
This is when your brain willfully ignores the macro picture to obsessively fixate on one single negative micro detail.
The classic example of this is taking a test with 100 questions. You score a 99, you got an A plus me, but you spend the next 3 days agonizing over the single question you got wrong, concluding, I'm an idiot, I don't know anything. Yeah. You abstracted one negative data point and allowed it to define your entire identity.
So common. Then you have dichotomous or polarized thinking.
Black and white thinking.
Exactly. Extreme black or white, all or nothing thinking. The brain completely deletes the gray area. Experiences are categorized as either absolute perfection or total unmitigated disaster. People are either saints or monsters.
So if you go on a strict diet and on day 4 you eat one single cookie, dichotomous thinking says, well, I've broken the diet, I have zero willpower, I'm a total failure, and you proceed to eat the entire box.
Right. It's a completely inflexible way to navigate a nuanced world.
Another incredibly common one is personalization. This is the ego's trap of assuming that you are the direct cause of external events that you actually have absolutely no control over.
Oh, yeah.
Like you walk into a retail store, the cashier doesn't make eye contact or smile at you, and your brain instantly personalizes it. They think, I look terrible today, I must give off a bad vibe.
When in reality, the cashier has been on their feet for 10 hours, their dog is sick, and their lack of a smile has literally nothing to do with you.
Exactly.
And we also have magnification and minimization, which often operate together. This is the mind acting like a distorted pair of binoculars. You look through one end to magnify your mistakes and flaws, blowing a minor social faux pas completely out of proportion.
And then you flip the binoculars around to minimize your achievements and positive qualities, treating a major success as just getting lucky or no big deal.
Exactly. To see how these interlocks, let's look at a case study from the materials about a client named Nancy.
Okay, Nancy.
So Nancy works as a retail sales clerk, but she desperately wants to move up and become an assistant buyer. She hates her current position. But every time the company posts an opening for a buyer, she finds a reason not to apply.
Why?
Well, she doesn't apply because of the interference of her automatic thoughts. She tells her friends, I'm just too busy right now, or I'll wait and apply after the holiday rush.
Rationalizations.
Right. But a skilled cognitive therapist recognizes those statements as rationalizations masking deeper distortions. When they gently probe, they uncover Nancy's actual hidden automatic thoughts. If I apply, I won't present myself well in the interview, and all the other candidates will be infinitely better than me.
Which are classic negative predictions, a clear form of catastrophizing and arbitrary inference. She is deciding the outcome before the event even happens.
Exactly.
And by organizing these thoughts, the therapist can trace them down to the root code. Nancy's underlying schema is a core belief of inadequacy. Deep down, she believes she's inherently not good enough.
Yes.
So her brain generates these distortions to protect her from taking a risk, because in her mind, the failure is already a guaranteed certainty.
It's exactly how it works.
Now, let me pause here, because this raises a very modern, sensitive issue. If a client is sitting in a therapist's office, deeply depressed, practically non-functional, and the therapist says, look, the problem here is that your thoughts are distorted. Your reasoning is faulty. You are catastrophizing. Is there a danger that this comes across as victim blaming? Doesn't that feel incredibly invalidating, like you're telling someone their suffering is just a self-inflicted delusion?
That is a phenomenal question, and it strikes at the absolute heart of what separates a mediocre therapist from a master cognitive therapist. Cognitive therapy, in its pure form, is vehemently opposed to blaming or judging the client. The therapist never takes a condescending stance, declaring thoughts to be wrong or irrational from a position of authority. Instead, the fundamental rule is that the therapist must operate entirely within the client's frame of reference.
Explain what that means in the room.
It means you view the world through the client's eyes. The premise is never that the client is defective or weak or foolish. The premise is that the client is doing the best they can, but they have unknowingly adopted a lens that is refracting the light incorrectly.
I see.
The therapist's job is to sit beside the client, gently help them take off the glasses, hold them up to the light together, and say, look at this curvature. Do you see how this lens might be warping the image? It is a process of mutual discovery, not a process of scolding.
That's a great metaphor. And that perfectly highlights the distinct difference between Aaron Beck's therapeutic style and Albert Ellis's style.
Right.
Where Ellis was a forceful debater who openly called beliefs irrational or even nutty, Beck actively disliked the term irrational. Beck preferred clinical objective terms like maladaptive, dysfunctional, or simply inaccurate.
Yes. Beck's overarching method is called collaborative empiricism.
Collaborative empiricism.
This is the engine of cognitive therapy. The therapist and the client form a research team. They act as co-scientists. They agree to treat the client's deeply held beliefs not as absolute, immovable truths, but merely as hypotheses that need to be rigorously tested against the empirical data of reality.
Let's test the hypothesis. It removes all the shame.
It really does.
And the primary laboratory tool they use to run these tests is the thought record, specifically the 3-column technique. Let's walk through how this works using the example of a client named Fred.
Okay, Fred. So Fred is a university music major. He is approaching his senior recital, and he is experiencing such paralyzing, debilitating performance anxiety that he is considering dropping out of the program entirely.
Oh, wow. So Fred comes into therapy, and he and the therapist pull out a blank piece of paper to map the anatomy of his panic. Column 1 is the situation. They write down the objective facts. Presenting my vocal performance at the senior recital, being evaluated by a panel of 3 music professors.
Right. Then column 2 is the automatic thought. The therapist asks, when you think about walking on stage, what exact words flash through your mind? Fred identifies the thought. The professors will think I am terrible and untalented.
Okay, and column 3 explores the meaning and the associated emotion. The therapist asks, if they do think you were terrible, what does that mean to you? For Fred, the meaning is, it means I fold under pressure and I have no future in music. And the resulting emotion is level 10, fight or flight panic.
And we also look at the behavioral consequence of this panic. Because Fred is so terrified by his own thought, his coping mechanism is to compulsively sing his recital song 5 times in a row every night.
Which is probably terrible for his voice.
Exactly. He is over-rehearsing, which exhausts his vocal cords, makes him sound worse, and perfectly reinforces his belief that he is going to fail. It is a vicious, self-fulfilling loop.
So the map is drawn. How do the co-scientists test the hypothesis that the professors will think I am terrible?
They gather the data. The therapist asks Fred, okay, let's look at the evidence supporting this thought. Fred admits he had one bad rehearsal 2 weeks ago where his voice cracked. The therapist writes it down.
Okay, one bad rehearsal.
Then they ask, now, as objective scientists, what is the evidence against this thought? Well, Fred has been studying intensively for 4 years. He has passed every previous jury evaluation with high marks. He practices 3 hours a day. And his personal vocal coach, an expert, has explicitly told him he is fully prepared.
So they literally put the thoughts on trial.
Yes.
And what almost always happens is that the evidence against the catastrophic thought absolutely crushes the evidence supporting it.
And by forcing the brain to slow down and perform this analysis repeatedly across dozens of situations, Fred begins to rewire his neurological pathways.
He builds a new habit.
Exactly. He learns to catch the distortion in real time, he feels the panic rising, and he learns to pause and say, I'm catastrophizing, I'm fortune-telling. Let's look at the actual data.
But, dealing with automatic thoughts is just treating the pop-up ads. What about the deep malware? If a client has a core schema built in childhood that says, I'm inherently worthless, a few thought records aren't going to fix that. How does cognitive therapy address the root code?
Modifying schemas is the most difficult and profound work in cognitive therapy. The sources outline 3 distinct levels of depth when it comes to changing these core beliefs.
Okay.
The first and most accessible level is schema reinterpretation. This is where the client recognizes their core schema, but rather than destroying it, they just learn to work around it.
Like a hack.
Yeah. For example, a person might have a rigid perfectionist schema. Instead of trying to stop being perfectionist, which might be too deeply ingrained, they adapt their environment. They take a job as a quality control inspector or a proofreader, where their perfectionism is actually an asset rather than a detriment to their daily life.
Oh, that's smart. It's a strategic bypass. What is the second level?
The second level is schema modification. This involves making significant but not total adjustments to the belief. Imagine a client with a deep schema of paranoia, the belief that people are inherently untrustworthy and will always betray me.
Right.
In schema modification, they don't flip entirely to trusting everyone, but they learn to bend the rule. They learn to say, most people might be unreliable, but I have gathered enough data to prove that my sister and my best friend are exceptions. They create healthy carve-outs within the rigid belief.
And the deepest level?
The deepest level is schematic restructuring. This is completely rewriting the operating system. This is taking that paranoid individual and, over a long period of therapy involving intense behavioral experiments and cognitive restructuring, helping them realize that their fundamental worldview is flawed. They restructure the belief to, most people are generally decent and trustworthy, even if a few are not. This completely alters the trajectory of their life.
This rigorous empirical approach, merging Beck's cognitive strategies with behavioral exposure techniques, created what we now call cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Yes.
It became the absolute gold standard of modern psychotherapy. It is heavily researched, highly structured, and empirically validated for treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, phobias. It is a powerhouse. But the evolution of psychology didn't just stop when CBT was finalized in the 1970s. As we move into the modern era, we have to explore what happened next.
Right, because as revolutionary and effective as CBT is, clinicians eventually realized it wasn't a magic bullet for every single person.
Of course not.
There were certain types of suffering where aggressively testing thoughts against evidence wasn't the right tool. This realization birthed what is known as the third wave of cognitive behavioral therapies. These models build on the sturdy foundations laid by Ellis and Beck, but they introduce entirely new mechanics, often integrating Eastern philosophies.
Let's look at some of the key figures here. The texts point us to Donald Meichenbaum, who developed cognitive behavior modification, and more specifically, a technique called stress inoculation training.
Yeah, Meichenbaum shifted the focus slightly. He was very interested in verbal mediational processes, which is just a technical term for the specific self-talk we use to navigate real-time stress.
Cool.
Stress inoculation training, or SIT, is a brilliant concept. Think of a medical inoculation. You inject a tiny, manageable amount of a virus into a person so their immune system can build antibodies. Meichenbaum did the same thing with psychological stress.
Oh, that makes sense.
The therapy intentionally exposes clients to manageable, graduated amounts of stress while proactively teaching them cognitive coping skills.
It's basically a fire drill for your nervous system. You don't wait for the crisis to figure out your coping mechanism. You map out the internal dialogue beforehand. You practice saying, when my boss starts yelling, my heart rate will go up. That's normal. I will take a breath, and I will remind myself that I can handle this without panicking. You pre-program the software for the exact moment the hardware is under attack.
It is highly proactive and incredibly effective for anxiety and trauma. But an even more radical shift in the third wave came when therapists encountered clients with severe emotional dysregulation. We are talking about individuals dealing with profound trauma, chronic suicidality, or borderline personality traits.
Right.
And the field realized that traditional CBT was struggling here. This led Marshall Linehan to develop dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT.
Now, why does traditional CBT struggle with severe emotional dysregulation? Like, if the thoughts are distorted, why doesn't the thought record work?
Think about the neurology of severe trauma. When a client's amygdala, the brain's threat center, is massively inflamed, their emotions are so agonizingly painful that their logical prefrontal cortex is completely offline.
They're just entirely in fight or flight.
Exactly. If a client is in a state of absolute psychological agony, actively wanting to self-harm, and the therapist pulls out a worksheet and says, let's check the empirical evidence for your catastrophizing, it feels completely invalidating. It feels like trying to put out a roaring forest fire by arguing with the flame.
It backfires. The client feels unheard, and the emotion escalates.
Exactly. This raises an important question. How do you intervene when the logic center is offline? So Linehan introduced a dialectic, a synthesis of two opposing forces. DBT integrates the change-based techniques of traditional CBT with the radical acceptance techniques of Zen mindfulness.
Oh, wow.
In DBT, the immediate goal isn't always to aggressively change or dispute the distorted thought. Sometimes the vital first step is teaching the client how to just tolerate the distress, how to be mindful, observe the intense emotion, and radically accept its presence without acting impulsively on it.
It's a massive philosophical pivot. You move from fighting the thought in a courtroom to just sort of sitting on a park bench and watching the thought walk by.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
And this concept of acceptance is taken even further by another major third-wave model, acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, developed by Russ Harris.
ACT is a beautiful model. It focuses heavily on building what is called psychological flexibility. ACT argues that human suffering is inevitable, and that a huge portion of our distress actually comes from our desperate, exhausting attempts to avoid or eliminate negative thoughts.
We spend all our energy fighting.
Exactly. So ACT teaches clients a process called diffusion.
Diffusion, like disconnecting the thought from your identity.
Yes. Instead of Ellis saying, dispute the irrational thought until it surrenders, ACT says, the thought is there. It's a painful, ugly thought. It says you are a failure. But you are not your thoughts. You are the space in which the thoughts happen.
That is profound.
ACT teaches you to drop the rope in the tug-of-war with your own mind. You accept that the internal weather is stormy, you allow the anxiety to sit in the passenger seat of your car, but you keep your hands on the steering wheel. And you drive the car in the direction of your deep chosen values. You commit to value-based action, regardless of what the pop-up ads in your head are saying.
Okay, let's step back and look at the sheer scale of the evolution we have mapped out today. It was truly the story of how humanity has fought to understand its own suffering. We started in the 1950s in the sterile labs of behaviorism, treating the mind as a locked black box. Ignore the thoughts. Just measure the behavior. The mind is irrelevant.
Yeah, we've come a long way.
And then the revolution hits. Albert Ellis kicks the door down and says, the thoughts are the only thing that matters. They are generating the pain. We must aggressively identify these irrational demands and dispute them with logic until they break.
Right. And then Aaron Beck walks in and refines the process with the precision of a scientist. Let's not debate. Let's collaborate. Let's map the automatic thoughts, identify the cognitive distortions, and test our schemas against the empirical data of reality to debug our operating system.
And finally, the third wave brings the wisdom of mindfulness into the laboratory. Therapies like DBT and ACT remind us that we are human. Sometimes the mind is chaotic, and trying to control every thought is a trap. Let's learn to accept the internal noise mindfully, diffuse from the pain, and focus our energy on living a meaningful life.
It is as if psychology spent 70 years writing and refining a progressively more sophisticated user manual for the human brain.
It really is. The core takeaway from all of these pioneers is one of the most empowering concepts you will ever encounter. Between the events that happened to you in the physical world and your emotional reaction to them, there was a microsecond of space.
Just a microsecond.
And in that microsecond, a belief is triggered, an automatic thought fires, a schema activates. You are not a passive, helpless victim of your environment. By learning to observe that microsecond, by spotting your own distortions, and by testing your own beliefs, you have the power to radically alter the trajectory of your emotional life. You can hack your own code.
It is the ultimate form of self-determination. But as we synthesize the legacy of Ellis and Beck, it leaves me with a lingering, provocative question, especially when we apply these tools to our modern reality. We've established that cognitive therapy, the gold standard of mental health, relies heavily on collaborative empiricism. It relies on testing our internal thoughts against the objective data of the external world. We look for the evidence. But what happens to the human psyche in an era defined by algorithmic social media feeds, curated filter bubbles, and AI-generated deepfakes?
Oh, that is a terrifying variable.
Think about it. When the external world, the primary data stream we consume for hours every day, is intentionally algorithmically designed by supercomputers to feed us distorted information, to hyper-magnify threats, to maximize our outrage, and to completely erase nuance, well, how do we distinguish our own internal cognitive distortions from a reality that is objectively distorting itself?
Right.
If the data we use to test our psychological hypotheses is fundamentally corrupted, how does empiricism work? Perhaps the next great frontier of cognitive therapy won't just be about fixing the individual's funhouse mirror in their own mind. It will be about learning how to maintain our sanity in a society that is increasingly built entirely out of them.
That is a chilling, profound point. We have to learn to question not just the software running in our heads, but the integrity of the data stream we are plugging our minds into every single day. We had to be fiercely protective of our attention. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. I highly encourage you to try being a co-scientist of your own mind this week. Pay attention to that microsecond, catch your automatic thoughts, and see if you can debug your own code. Until next time.